January 17th, 1943. Stockholm, Sweden. Asterisk asterisk. The harbor wind cuts through the narrow streets like a blade forged in the Baltic itself. Snow falls in heavy silence over the neutral city, muffling the sound of footsteps on cobblestone, concealing the movements of men who trade in secrets. In a modest apartment overlooking Stortorget Square, a middle-aged German businessman sits at a wooden desk, his hands trembling as he writes. The ink flows across the page in careful script, not the bold strokes of a confident man, but the hesitant marks of one who knows that every word he commits to paper could mean his death. His name is Fritz Kolbe, and in this moment, as the candle beside him flickers against the winter darkness, he is about to change the course of human history in ways that no single bullet or bomb ever could. The letter he writes is addressed to Alan Dulles, the American Office of Strategic Services Station Chief in Bern, Switzerland. In it are details that Berlin believes are safely locked behind layers of security, buried in classified files that only the most trusted Nazi officials can access. But Kolbe has access. And more importantly, Kolbe has made a choice that will haunt and define him for the rest of his life. A choice to betray everything his country demands of him in service of something he believes is larger than national loyalty, the preservation of human civilization itself. This is not a story the victors have celebrated with monuments or medals. There are no statues of Fritz Kolbe in Washington or London, no films that bear his name across their opening credits. For decades, his contributions remained classified, his identity protected even in death. But the intelligence he provided, over 1,600 classified documents passed to the Americans over 2 years, prevented countless deaths, shortened the war by months if not years, and exposed Nazi operations across 3 continents. Military historians who have studied the declassified files use words like unprecedented and irreplaceable. One OSS officer who worked directly with the intelligence called it the greatest single source of secret information in World War II. Yet Kolbe himself never sought glory. He asked for no payment, refused every offer of extraction or protection, and returned again and again to the heart of Nazi Germany, walking willingly into the lion's den with pockets full of stolen secrets, driven by a conviction that grew stronger with every atrocity he witnessed from within the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich. To understand why one man's espionage mattered so profoundly, we must first understand what the Allies faced in 1943. The war had turned into a brutal, grinding campaign of attrition. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps still threatened Allied supply lines. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced, starving Britain of the resources needed to continue fighting. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were locked in savage combat at Stalingrad, a battle that would cost over 2 million casualties. And in the Pacific, American forces were only beginning to reverse Japanese territorial gains through island-hopping campaigns that exacted terrible prices in blood for every mile of coral and jungle. Intelligence in modern warfare is often compared to sight on a battlefield. The side that can see farther and clearer holds an almost insurmountable advantage. But in 1943, the Allies were operating with partial blindness. They had brilliant codebreakers at Bletchley Park who had cracked the Enigma cipher, giving them access to encrypted German military communications. They had resistance networks in occupied territories feeding them tactical information. They had aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. But they lacked something crucial: insight into the strategic thinking at the highest levels of Nazi leadership, access to the diplomatic cables and foreign ministry reports that revealed not just what Hitler's forces were doing, but what they planned to do, where they were weak, and what they feared most. This was the gap that Fritz Kolbe would fill. Not with the dramatic heroics of commandos or the technical brilliance of scientists, but with the quiet, methodical courage of a bureaucrat who understood that the papers crossing his desk each day represented power that could be turned against those who wielded it with such monstrous intent. Kolbe had not begun the war as a resistance figure. Born in 1900 in Berlin, he grew up in the ruins of Imperial Germany, witnessed the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and watched with growing alarm as the Nazi Party rose to power in the early 1930s. He joined the German Foreign Office in 1925, building a career in diplomatic circles, traveling to Spain, South Africa, and eventually back to Berlin as the continent spiraled toward war. His superiors found him capable but unremarkable, a reliable functionary who processed documents, arranged meetings, and kept the machinery of German diplomacy functioning smoothly. But Kolbe was watching. He saw how men he had once respected became complicit in barbarism, how the language of diplomacy was twisted to justify aggression, how the veneer of civilized statecraft concealed machinery designed for conquest and extermination. When he learned of the concentration camps, when reports of mass executions filtered through the foreign ministry's intelligence channels, when he saw the orders for deportations and liquidations stamped with official seals, something fundamental broke inside him. Or perhaps something fundamental was forged. He began to collect documents. At first just copies of routine cables, testing whether he could smuggle papers out of the ministry without detection. Then, as his access increased when he was assigned to the Foreign Office's Personnel Department in 1943, he became bolder. He worked late into the evenings, photographing documents with a small camera, or simply folding originals into his coat when he knew they would not be immediately missed. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant torture and execution, not just for him, but for his family. The Gestapo had refined interrogation into a science of agony, and they made examples of traitors in ways calculated to terrorize others into obedience. Yet Kolbe persisted, driven by what he would later describe as a moral clarity so overwhelming that fear became irrelevant. He had expected that serving his country would mean upholding its laws and defending its people. What he actually experienced was watching his country transform into something unrecognizable, a machinery of death that wrapped itself in patriotic language while committing crimes that shattered his understanding of what civilization meant. The contrast between the Germany he had believed in and the Germany he now served was so profound that continued complicity became impossible. In August 1943, Kolbe made his first trip to Bern, Switzerland, using his position in the Foreign Office to arrange diplomatic courier duties that gave him legitimate reasons to cross the border. He carried with him nearly 200 classified documents hidden in a leather satchel. His plan was desperate and amateur. He would approach the British embassy, present his credentials and his stolen intelligence, and offer his services as a spy against the Nazi regime. The British turned him away. It seems almost incomprehensible now, knowing what he carried. But British intelligence officers in Bern suspected a trap. The documents seemed too good to be true, the offer too perfect. They believed Kolbe was a German plant, sent to feed the Allies false information that would lead them into strategic mistakes. They thanked him politely and showed him the door, leaving him standing in the Swiss summer heat with a satchel full of secrets and nowhere to take them. Kolbe did not give up. The next day, he approached the American OSS office, where a junior officer named Gerald Mayer agreed to meet with him. Mayer, unlike his British counterparts, saw past the improbability of the offer and looked at the documents themselves. What he found left him stunned. These were not the kind of papers that could be fabricated or forged for deception purposes. They included detailed information about Nazi diplomatic efforts in Turkey and Spain, about German intelligence operations in South America, about military deployments that Allied forces had only suspected. Mayer immediately contacted Alan Dulles, who authorized him to bring Kolbe and his documents to a safe house for detailed examination. For 3 days, American intelligence officers pored over the material Kolbe had brought. They cross-referenced it with other intelligence sources, looked for inconsistencies or planted falsehoods, tested it against known facts. Everything checked out. More than that, it opened windows into German operations that the Allies had been blind to. Dulles, who would later become the director of the CIA, immediately recognized what he had: the most valuable intelligence source in Nazi Germany, a man with access to the foreign ministry's most sensitive materials and the courage to risk everything to provide them to the enemy. They gave him a code name, George Wood. And they arranged for him to return to Berlin with instructions on how to communicate, how to arrange future meetings, and most importantly, how to continue operating without getting caught. Over the next 2 years, Kolbe made regular trips to Switzerland, each time carrying documents that reshaped Allied understanding of Nazi operations. The information he provided was staggering in its scope and specificity. He delivered details on German agents operating in Allied countries, allowing counterintelligence services to neutralize entire spy networks. He provided technical specifications for V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, enabling the Allies to target production facilities and disrupt the development of weapons that could have devastated London. He revealed the locations of submarine bases and supply depots, helping the Allies win the Battle of the Atlantic that had threatened to starve Britain into submission. But the most valuable intelligence concerned German diplomatic and strategic intentions. Kolbe's document showed where Nazi leadership believed the Allies would invade Europe, allowing Eisenhower and his staff to understand how effectively their deception operations were working in the lead-up to D-Day. They revealed which neutral countries were covertly aiding Germany and which were genuinely maintaining neutrality, shaping Allied diplomatic strategy. They exposed efforts by Nazi officials to negotiate separate peace agreements with Western powers that would exclude the Soviet Union, allowing Roosevelt and Churchill to understand the fractures in German leadership as the war turned against them. One document Kolbe provided in late 1943 detailed German preparations for what they called the Alpenfestung, the Alpine Fortress, a supposed plan to retreat into the mountains of Bavaria and Austria for a final stand that could prolong the war for years. American military planners took this intelligence seriously, diverting resources to prevent such a redoubt from forming. Historians still debate whether the Alpenfestung was ever genuinely planned or merely discussed as a possibility, but the intelligence shaped Allied strategy in the war's final months, potentially preventing a bloody mountain campaign that could have cost tens of thousands of additional lives. The documents arrived in Berlin folders, in diplomatic pouches, bearing official stamps and signatures. Each one represented hours that Kolbe spent alone in offices after his colleagues had gone home, photographing papers by lamplight, memorizing details in case he was searched, preparing cover stories to explain why he was working late or carrying certain files. The psychological strain was immense. He had to maintain perfect normalcy, attending ministry functions, participating in the mandatory Nazi salutes and loyalty oaths, engaging in casual conversations with SS officers, all while knowing that his pockets contained materials that could hang him from a meat hook in Plötzensee prison, where the Gestapo executed traitors with slow strangulation using piano wire. What Kolbe expected when he first approached the Allies was simple acknowledgement that someone in power would recognize the moral catastrophe unfolding in Germany and accept help in stopping it. What he actually experienced was suspicion, bureaucratic caution, and the lonely burden of operating completely alone. The British rejection in particular seemed to validate his worst fear, that the Allies might not understand what was at stake, that they might see the war as just another conflict between nations rather than a struggle against something fundamentally evil. Even after the Americans accepted him, Kolbe was isolated. He could not tell his family what he was doing. He had no fellow conspirators in Berlin, no network of resistance fighters to provide support or share the psychological weight. Other resistance groups like the Kreisau Circle or the officers who would attempt to assassinate Hitler in July 1944 at least had each other. They could speak openly among themselves, draw strength from shared conviction. Kolbe had only his own conscience and the certain knowledge that if he stopped, valuable intelligence would remain hidden, operations would go undetected, and people would die who might otherwise be saved. The symbolic object that recurred through Kolbe's experience was not American abundance or military might, but paper itself. The documents he stole and copied were not dramatic. They were bureaucratic, dense with diplomatic language and administrative detail. But paper was the medium through which Nazi power operated. Orders for deportations came on paper. Intelligence reports that guided military operations arrived on paper. Diplomatic cables that shaped strategic decisions flowed across desks in paper form. Kolbe understood that the Third Reich's atrocities were not committed solely by men with guns, but by men with pens, by bureaucrats who processed paperwork that transformed human beings into statistics, into problems to be solved through industrial murder. By stealing those papers, By removing them from the channels where they would inform Nazi decision-making and placing them in Allied hands where they would inform resistance to Nazi aggression, Kolbe was engaging in a kind of symbolic reversal. He was taking the machinery of bureaucratic evil and turning it against itself, transforming the very instruments of Nazi power into weapons for its destruction. Each document he passed to the Americans represented not just tactical intelligence, but a small act of redemption, proof that the papers could be used to save rather than condemn, to expose rather than conceal. The Allied intelligence officers who worked with Kolbe's materials sometimes struggled to comprehend the risks he was taking. They operated from safe houses in neutral Switzerland, with diplomatic protection and extraction plans if their cover was blown. Kolbe had nothing but his own courage and the thin protection of his official position. Every trip to Switzerland could be his last if German counterintelligence had even the slightest suspicion. Every document he removed from ministry files was a potential death warrant if its absence was noticed. Yet he continued, trip after trip, delivering intelligence that American and British analysts would later describe as instrumental in shortening the war. The exact quantification is impossible. History does not offer controlled experiments where we can measure what would have happened without his contributions. But we have the assessments of the officers who used his intelligence, and their language is unambiguous. General William Donovan, who headed the OSS, reviewed the Wood intelligence and concluded that it provided insight into Nazi operations that could not have been obtained from any other source. British intelligence officers, once they finally examined the materials they had rejected, acknowledged that their initial refusal had been one of the greatest intelligence blunders of the war. By early 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied offensives from east and west, Kolbe's position became increasingly dangerous. The Gestapo was hunting for leaks, executing suspects on minimal evidence, purging the Foreign Office of anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable. Kolbe made his final trip to Switzerland in April 1945, carrying documents that revealed the chaos in Nazi leadership as defeat became inevitable, cables showing competing factions trying to secure escape routes, evidence of Swiss banks accepting deposits from SS officers preparing to flee, details about the locations where Nazi officials were destroying records of their crimes. When the war ended, Kolbe expected recognition, perhaps even gratitude from the German people once they understood what he had done to help end the nightmare. What he actually experienced was suspicion and hostility. In post-war Germany, particularly in the occupied zones that would become West Germany, there was little appetite for celebrating those who had betrayed the nation during wartime, regardless of the moral justifications. Kolbe found himself unemployable in the new German civil service, tainted by his cooperation with Allied intelligence. His former colleagues shunned him. He received anonymous threats from unrepentant Nazis who viewed him as a traitor worse than the Allies themselves. The Americans offered him a modest pension and helped him relocate, but even within the intelligence community, Kolbe's contributions were classified and unacknowledged. The Cold War was beginning, and American intelligence agencies were already recruiting former Nazi intelligence officers who were considered useful in the struggle against Soviet communism. Men who had served Hitler faithfully were given positions and protection, while Kolbe, who had risked everything to oppose the regime, lived in obscurity and near poverty. He spent his later years in Switzerland, working odd jobs, living simply, refusing interviews and attention on the rare occasions when journalists discovered a story. He never sought payment for his wartime activities beyond the minimal support the Americans provided. He never wrote a memoir or attempted to profit from his experiences. When asked why he had done it, he gave answers that were stark in their simplicity. I could see what was happening. I could do something about it. So I did. The transformation in Kolbe was complete, but not in the direction that patriotic narratives typically celebrate. He had begun as a loyal German civil servant who believed in the ideals of his nation's diplomatic service. The war transformed him into something that has no easy national label, a man whose loyalty shifted from country to conscience, who came to believe that some crimes are so fundamental that they void the claims of national allegiance. He experienced firsthand the horror of watching institutions he respected become instruments of genocide, and that experience burned away his illusions about the moral weight of patriotic duty. In 1971, the CIA finally declassified enough information to allow Kolbe's story to be told publicly. Historians began examining the George Wood intelligence files, and the magnitude of his contributions became clear. But by then Kolbe was an old man, living quietly in Bern, largely forgotten by the nation he had helped save from itself and ignored by the nations he had helped to victory. He died in 1971, the same year the first accurate accounts of his espionage appeared in print, too late to witness the historical recognition that would slowly accumulate in subsequent decades. The legacy of Fritz Kolbe exists not in monuments, but in the millions of lives that extended beyond 1945, because the war ended when it did rather than dragging on for additional months or years. Every piece of intelligence he provided created opportunities for Allied planners to make better decisions, for military operations to be conducted more efficiently, for diplomatic strategies to be crafted with fuller understanding of the enemy's intentions and weaknesses. The cumulative effect was a war shortened by increments, each one measured in lives that did not have to be sacrificed on battlefields or lost in bombed cities. Consider the WW2 rocket program. The intelligence Kolbe provided about production facilities allowed the Allies to target them with bombing raids that delayed deployment and reduced the number of rockets that ultimately fell on London and Antwerp. Historians estimate that roughly 9,000 people died from WW2 attacks during the war. Without Kolbe's intelligence enabling more effective targeting of production sites, that number could have been significantly higher. Each person who survived because a rocket was never built, or fell short, or malfunctioned because of disrupted production represents a life saved by a man copying documents in Berlin offices after dark. Consider the intelligence on German operations in neutral countries. By exposing Nazi spy networks and diplomatic manipulation efforts in Turkey, Spain, Portugal, and South America, Kolbe's documents allowed Allied counterintelligence to neutralize operations that could have extended German reach and capabilities. Every German agent arrested or turned because of Wood intelligence was an agent who could not gather information on Allied movements, could not commit sabotage, could not assist in operations against Allied interests. Consider the strategic planning for D-Day. The Allies invested enormous effort in Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. Kolbe's intelligence provided insight into how German leadership was interpreting Allied preparations, allowing planners to understand whether their deception was working. The success of that deception meant that key German armored divisions were held in reserve far from the invasion beaches, reducing the initial resistance that American, British, and Canadian forces faced when they came ashore on June 6, 1944. Every soldier who survived that day because German defenses were weaker than they might have been owes something to intelligence that shaped strategic planning, intelligence that included the documents Kolbe smuggled out of Berlin. The story of Fritz Kolbe forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, patriotism, and the moral foundations of citizenship. He was, by the definition of his own government, a traitor, a man who violated his oath of office, betrayed state secrets to the enemy, and actively worked for the military defeat of his own country. Yet history has largely vindicated his choices, recognizing that there exist circumstances where national allegiance becomes morally untenable, where the crimes of one's own government are so profound that opposition becomes an ethical imperative regardless of the personal cost. This is not a comfortable narrative for nations built on concepts of patriotic duty. It suggests that conscience can and sometimes must supersede national loyalty, that there are causes larger than country. The soldiers who fought for the Allies are celebrated precisely because their national loyalty aligned with what is broadly recognized as the morally correct side of the conflict. But Kolbe chose morality over nationality, and in doing so exposed the tension between the two that patriotic rhetoric typically obscures. What made his espionage so effective was precisely what made it so personally costly. Because he was a genuine German civil servant with legitimate access to classified materials, his intelligence was irreplaceable. A spy planted by the Allies would never have gained the same access or trust. But this authenticity meant that Kolbe had to live the contradiction fully, maintaining his position in a government apparatus he despised, going through the motions of loyalty while systematically betraying every secret he could access. The psychological cost of such prolonged duplicity is difficult to measure, but the evidence is in the life he lived afterward. Isolated, damaged, unable to fully return to normal civilian existence, even after the war ended. In the decades since his death, as more intelligence files have been declassified and more historians have studied his contributions, Kolbe has slowly received recognition. The CIA has acknowledged him as one of the most important intelligence sources of World War II. Monuments have been erected in Berlin and in Bern. Historians include him in accounts of resistance to Nazism, alongside more famous figures like Claus von Stauffenberg and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But the recognition remains incomplete, perhaps because his story does not fit neatly into triumphalist narratives about either German resistance or Allied intelligence operations. The recurring symbol in Kolbe's story, the paper documents he stole and transmitted, represent something profound about the nature of modern evil and modern resistance. The Holocaust was administered with paperwork. The Wehrmacht's invasions were planned with documents. The Nazi state functioned through bureaucracy, through the systematic processing of information and orders that transformed ideology into action. Kolbe understood that to resist such a system, one had to subvert its information flows, to introduce uncertainty and exposure into the channels where secrets became plans and plans became atrocities. In this way, his espionage was not just tactically valuable, but symbolically appropriate. He fought the regime's machinery with its own mechanisms, turning its dependence on documentation and bureaucratic procedure into a vulnerability. Every document he removed from German files and placed in Allied hands was a small disruption in the system, a moment where the Nazi state's secrets became Allied knowledge, where the veil of security that allowed the regime to operate was pierced. As the winter wind cuts through Stockholm harbor on this January evening in 1943, as Fritz Kolbe seals the letter that will begin his career as one of history's most consequential spies, he cannot know how the story will end. He cannot know that his courage will save countless lives, that his intelligence will reshape Allied strategy, that historians will eventually rank him among the most important resistance figures of the war. All he knows is that he has documents the enemy needs, and that providing them is both monumentally dangerous and morally necessary. This is the arithmetic of individual conscience in wartime. One man, armed with nothing but access and conviction, deciding that the machinery of genocide must be opposed even at the cost of everything he has built, everyone he loves, and possibly his own life. The calculation is simple and terrible. If he does nothing, he remains safe but complicit. If he acts, he risks everything but creates the possibility of reducing the suffering, of shortening the nightmare, of ensuring that the crimes he witnesses from within the bureaucratic heart of Nazi Germany are exposed and documented for the reckoning that must eventually come. He chooses to act. And in that choice, made in isolation in a neutral city while the war rages across the continent, Fritz Kolbe demonstrates something fundamental about the relationship between individual conscience and historical catastrophe. We like to believe that such horrors are opposed by armies and leaders, by grand strategies and decisive battles. And those things matter enormously. But sometimes history turns on quieter pivots, on the courage of a bureaucrat with access to files, willing to carry secrets across borders, willing to live with the constant fear of discovery, willing to betray his country in service of a larger loyalty to human decency itself. The documents he carries are precise in their detail, damning in their content. They reveal the locations of German agents in Allied capitals, the specifications of secret weapons under development, the strategic assessments that guide Hitler's military decisions. Each one is a piece of the puzzle that Allied intelligence desperately needs to complete its picture of the enemy's capabilities and intentions. Each one represents hours of risk, time spent alone in offices, photographing papers, creating pretexts for why he needed access to certain files, preparing explanations in case someone questions his presence or his activities. But they are just papers. The real weapon Kolbe wields is the recognition that information itself is power, and that power can be redirected, turned against those who believe themselves secure in their secrets. The Nazi state depended on secrecy about the camps, about military dispositions, about diplomatic maneuvering, about technological development. Every secret exposed diminished that power, created openings for opposition, allowed the Allies to counter moves they would otherwise not have seen coming. In the decades after the war, intelligence agencies studied the George Wood case as a model of successful espionage and a cautionary tale about institutional skepticism. The British rejection of Kolbe's initial approach became a case study in how intelligence services can be too cautious, too suspicious, missing opportunities because they seem too good to be true. The American decision to take the risk and work with him became an example of calculated boldness paying dividends beyond anything that could have been predicted. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest, that individuals matter, that conscience matters, that the choice to act in the face of overwhelming evil can have consequences far beyond what any single person can anticipate. Kolbe did not have grand strategic vision or military expertise. He had access to documents and the moral clarity to recognize that those documents needed to reach people who would use them to fight the regime he served in name, but opposed in every action that mattered. The epilogue to his life, the obscurity, the financial struggles, the lack of recognition until long after his death, speaks to a hard truth about moral courage. History eventually honors those who make such choices, but often not in time for them to benefit from that honor. Kolbe lived long enough to see the regime he helped defeat utterly destroyed, but not long enough to see his role fully acknowledged. He died knowing what he had done, but not knowing that future generations would recognize it as among the most important individual contributions to Allied victory. The final reflection returns to that image of Kolbe at his desk, writing the letter that will connect him to Allen Dulles and the OSS, committing himself to a course of action that will define and consume the rest of the war years. The candle flickers, the snow falls, and in the quiet of a neutral city while millions die across the continent, a single man makes a choice that embodies something essential about the relationship between individual agency and historical necessity. Freedom, we often say, is defended on battlefields. Democracy is preserved by armies. These things are true. But freedom is also defended by the clerk who steals documents that expose tyranny's secrets. Democracy is preserved by the civil servant who recognizes that his first allegiance is to human dignity rather than national power. The story of World War II is filled with heroic soldiers and brilliant generals, with strategic masterstrokes and technological innovations. But it is also the story of Fritz Kolbe, who understood that the papers crossing his desk each day were windows into the machinery of evil, and that leaving those windows closed while he safely advanced his career was a form of complicity he could not tolerate. The documents he provided traveled from Berlin to Bern to London and Washington, where analysts pored over them, extracting insights that shaped operations across every theater of the war. They contributed to the slow, grinding process by which the Allied coalition outfought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately destroyed the Nazi regime. No single document ended the war. No single piece of intelligence turned the tide. But cumulatively, over 2 years of regular contributions, the Wood intelligence gave the Allies an advantage they would not otherwise have possessed, a window into the highest levels of Nazi decision-making, a constant stream of verified information about enemy intentions and capabilities. This was not the espionage of popular imagination, with gun battles and midnight escapes. It was the espionage of patience and documentation, of careful record-keeping and methodical risk-taking. Kolbe's weapon was not a pistol but a camera, not a knife but his memory for where documents were filed and when they would not be immediately missed. His victories were not measured in enemy soldiers killed but in Allied operations made more effective, in Jewish refugees whose escape routes were protected because German surveillance operations were exposed, in American bomber crews who hit their targets because they had better intelligence on what needed to be destroyed. The greatest espionage mission of World War II was conducted by a man whose name remained secret for decades, whose contributions were classified, whose courage was rewarded with poverty and isolation in his later years. Fritz Kolbe saved millions not by any single dramatic action, but through the accumulated effect of hundreds of choices to risk everything in service of stopping a regime whose crimes he witnessed from the inside. He expected recognition, perhaps, or at least safety. What he experienced was suspicion from those he helped, hostility from those he betrayed, and the lonely knowledge that he had done what conscience required regardless of the cost. His legacy is not in monuments or medals, though those have slowly come. It is in the arithmetic of lives saved and suffering prevented, in the months by which the war was shortened, in the operations that succeeded because planners had intelligence they needed and would not otherwise have possessed. It is in the example he provides of moral courage in the face of institutionalized evil, the recognition that some crimes void the claims of national loyalty, that conscience can and must supersede allegiance when the gap between them becomes too profound to bridge. As that candle burns down in the Stockholm apartment, as the letter is sealed and prepared for delivery, as Fritz Kolbe commits himself to treason in service of humanity, the symbolic weight of those stolen documents grows heavier. They represent not just tactical intelligence, but a fundamental challenge to totalitarian power. The recognition that secrecy can be broken, that information can flow against the channels that dictators construct, that one individual with access and courage can subvert the machinery of state terror. This is what one spy accomplished. This is how espionage saved millions. Not through the fantasy heroics of fiction, but through the grinding, terrifying, lonely work of a man who chose to fight evil with the only weapons he possessed: access to secrets, the courage to steal them, and the moral clarity to recognize that some battles must be fought regardless of the personal cost. In the vast history of World War II, amid the millions who fought and died, Fritz Kolbe stands as proof that individuals matter, that conscience can change history, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not on battlefields, but in offices where a single person decides that enough is enough, that complicity has become intolerable, and that the only remaining choice is to act, whatever the consequence, whatever the cost, because the alternative, silence and safety while atrocities continue, is too terrible to bear.